Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Wednesday night Theosophical lecture. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Gerard Brennan here tonight, and he'll be lecturing us on sacred places and inner spaces, the longest journey to the nearest place. Sounds like a fascinating topic. We're really fortunate, Gerard, that you've come up from Sydney after work and going back tomorrow. So thank you for coming up and taking the time to share this with us. For those of you that don't know, Gerard has been a member of the Theosophical Society for over 25 years and has a personal interest in the deeper aspects of Theosophy. Professionally, he taught English literature and now is a state rep for New South Wales and the ACT and a member of the National Council of the TS in Australia. And he is currently serving as the president of the Indo-Pacific Federation of the Theosophical Society and a member of the National Council of the TS in Australia. So we're looking forward to your lecture, and without further ado, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Everyone hear me okay? Good. Well, what a pleasure to be back in Brisbane Lodge. And as usual, anything to escape Sydney is always very welcome, especially to come up here to the Sunshine State. So let's hope tonight we continue that tradition of spreading light. There's so much light in Queensland and clearly so much light in this lodge. So it really is good to be here. So intriguing title, I think you'll agree. Sacred places and inner spaces. Raise your hand if you've been to a sacred place. We've probably all been to many. Hands up if you found a sacred space within yourself. They're really not very different. It's the nearest place we can almost touch it, see it, feel it, and yet it seems sometimes like the longest journey. I can't really speak for anyone else but myself, but having been to many places, you will term the sacred around the world and working on the spiritual journey. Sometimes it can be easy, sometimes it can be very difficult, sometimes it can be full of joy, sometimes it can be so dry, there's nothing fluid about it or moist about it at all. So tonight we're going to explore it with some slides along the way. So this presentation will journey to sacred places around the world, in our minds and with a few pictures as well. Striving to reawaken those perhaps dormant inner spaces where we encounter the spiritual. Of course, we can encounter that externally, but it's true to suggest that when we look within, in a peaceful state of mind, where the mind is very, very still, we can better perhaps appreciate those spiritual realities. So even though the journey may seemingly cover vast distances, so I'm talking to a theosophical audience, so how many lifetimes have we been at this, trying to get it right? And here we are in samsara, running around lifetime after lifetime. And eventually at some point, we're bound to get off this wheel and actually get it right. So the destination, however, may be closer, far closer than we could ever imagine. And that is the contention of this talk. So let's take a little diversion along the way together. And who knows where we might end up. I can't guarantee we'll end up in Shangri-La, but that would be a very nice place to have a little rest, perhaps, a little holiday, a sojourn, a sabbatical for a little while. But we may find some peace and perhaps leave here a little bit more peaceful than when we left. Maybe we might find ourselves right back where we began on the spiritual journey. And there is no doubt that we have all been on the spiritual journey for some time. So, Jared, I'm going to call upon you while I go ahead. I need to get back to the, back to the USB and all those drives. So this evening, we're going to consider together the idea of sacred places and inner places and how they are very similar and intimately connected. We perhaps consider a sacred place to be some type of religious building, temple, a church, or perhaps a place of pilgrimage. Raise your hand if you've ever actually been on a pilgrimage to a sacred or holy place. There's something special about it, isn't it? And afterwards, we feel a little bit great about going there. But of course, there are times as well where perhaps we reach that place and it may not necessarily meet our expectations. Whatever the structure, there is an expectation that when we go to a sacred place, a temple, a mosque, a holy place, the experience is likely to be transformative. And quite recently, on the way back from London, I had the opportunity to stop in Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates, where some of you may have been, or perhaps you've been to Dubai. And they have a place there which I would highly recommend called the Abrahamic Family House. It's a bit limited just to the Abrahamic religions, but there they have a mosque, a church, and a synagogue in one place. And prayers go on there. The Muslims have Friday prayers, the Christians have their prayers on Sunday, and I presume the synagogue would operate on the Saturday. They're not saying all religions are the same, but they're looking to find peace between them. It's such a beautiful experience to be somewhere that takes all the politics out of religion and just focuses on the spirituality. So I found that quite recently to be a very moving place of pilgrimage where people sit together. I thought it was strangely very theosophical, actually. As a child, have you ever dreamt of going to a special place inspired by your imagination? A secret garden, perhaps, or a place in the heavens, where your dreams may come true. Whatever happened to the vast imagination we possessed as children? Does anyone know what happened to that?
Adults.
We just got older, where we dared to dream of amazing places and of worlds well beyond the ordinary. Have we simply become old, or has our youthful idealism become somewhat toiled and tarnished by the ravages of time? Maybe I suspect it's the latter. Can you remember how that inner imaginative world from our childhood? Can you remember that, and how naturally our senses turned within from those places around us to those inner spaces which seemed so vivid? Can you indeed remember as children when your inner imagination was more vivid and more real than the world around us? I think we all have a taste of that, or had a taste of that when we were younger. Perhaps we didn't have so many computers and devices to distract us from the beauty of our own imagination. As such, have we become so consumed by the demands of the external world that it has dampened our sense of wonderment at creation, at the stars, at the heavens, at the little miracles in front of us that occur every day if we have the eyes to see? As a noted romanticist poet once wrote, "I am certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination." John Keats. Have you ever read his poetry, John Keats? It's beautiful, isn't it? So maybe there comes a point in our lives where our daily existence, as we grow older, doesn't quite seem to be satisfactory. Mostly in modern, well-developed countries like ours, we have everything we need to ensure our material happiness, and yet something is missing. Maybe in certain other cultures, without romanticizing them, they still seem happy, joyful at simple things. Maybe materialism at a very deeper level has poisoned us to such an extent that we simply judge others based on how much money they have, what kind of car they drive, what kind of house they live in, how many possessions they have, all these superficial things that really have no meaning at all to who we really are and what our true nature really is. Maybe life has just become a little bit insipid. Life, therefore, seems to be a journey to recapture who and what we once were, which may be a closer reflection to the divine. It's said that children somehow are closer to the divine than us, only to realize we have never been anything else but that all the time. But we forget our true identity. It seems that all we have to do is close our eyes and look within, and yet we may find a restless mind that finds it difficult to settle down. So later on we'll come back to the monkey mind stung by a scorpion. The mind's like that, isn't it? We speak of seeking spiritual transformation, and yet perhaps are a little hesitant of its consequences. I mean, look at the life of the Buddha. He, having seen suffering, went outside the palace and saw the people die, they get old, there's such a thing as disease, poverty, and all those kinds of things. And look what it did to him. He was completely transformed. Aren't we a little bit scared of spiritual transformation and the effect it might have on our lives? We are surely compelled to leave many things behind in order to embrace something new, in order to embrace it fully without a conditioned kind of mind. Any journey, even going on a holiday, involves leaving the familiar behind and only taking what is necessary. We've all had that experience of trying to pack for an overseas holiday. What do you take? And what do you leave behind? Well, applying that to the spiritual journey, what do you leave behind? Maybe at some point we have to just jettison our luggage and put it down. Because if we carry that baggage around with us all the time, we won't have any peace. So too, the spiritual journey can only be like that, where we still carry some baggage perhaps until at least we are ready to let it go. And as you get older, perhaps, we get better at doing that. To let go of the accumulated things we have surrounded ourselves with, which we don't really need. And they could be mental things as well. They could be emotional things. They could be so many things. It requires no doubt some courage to let go and find ourselves. But the journey is inevitable for all of us. And tread it we must. Otherwise, what are we doing here in this lifetime, in this particular incarnation? Rumi, of course, says, now somewhere along the line here, if this all works, I found quite an interesting picture. This is one suggestion of what indeed he may look like. As you start to walk on the way appears. Have you ever found that? That at a particular time you just happen to be in the right place at the right moment. So I'll share a little bit of synchronicity with you, and you might think, well, it could be synchronicity or it could just be chance. So in a recent trip to London, I wanted to visit a big temple, the Swami Narayan Temple, which is quite magnificent, a little bit gaudy, but they have a beautiful exhibition and some beautiful ideas as well, which they promote. But I took the wrong turn. So it's in Neasden in North London in the borough of Brent. So instead of turning right, I turned left. But when I turned left, after a few streets, I found a street called Besant Way. And Besant Way was where Annie Besant in the old days used to work with the girls in the matchstick factory. She did a lot of work for the poorer people of London, the girls in particular, and that's where she worked. So it could have been synchronicity, it could have been coincidence, it could have been whatever, but it does leave you thinking, if you'd gone that way, the outcome would have been completely different. And maybe in the spiritual life, we've all had experiences like that, haven't we? That maybe are open at least to question. As you start to walk on the way appears. Having decided to embark on the spiritual journey, otherwise why would we be here? Where do we go? There are those who have gone before us. And that's one good thing about this journey. And we have their guidance. They could be people like Rumi, the great saints, the great masters, the great teachers that have gone before us. Though only we can walk it ourselves. No one can do it. And yet we want to rely on others. It's so easy to do that. They can point the way, but they can't give it to us. Even Rumi can't give it to us. Like any journey, there may be a mixture of fear, trepidation, or sheer excitement, as we do not know what lies before us. Life is like that. When will our life end? We don't know. On the one hand, it's scary. On the other hand, it's really exciting, isn't it? We have the accounts of pilgrims from the past who have been overwhelmed by their experiences. You would have made your own way across Europe, all the way to Rome in ancient times, and then on to the Holy Land by sea, and people did. Even today, pilgrimage is an essential part of the religious practices of many people who are encouraged to undertake such a journey at least once in a lifetime. Many Buddhists today make their way to Sana, where the Buddha preached his first sermon after attaining enlightenment at Bodh Gaya. Has anyone been to those places, Bodh Gaya or Sana? It's an amazing experience, isn't it? Hundreds of thousands of Hindus make their way to the holy city Varanasi, which is regarded still as the spiritual capital of India, and indeed a very ancient place. Who's been to Varanasi? Incredible place, isn't it? Very ancient, timeless. It's said that the Buddha perhaps had walked along that way a long time ago. It is said that the city of Varanasi never touches the ground, as it is held up by Lord Shiva himself, who sits in the Vishwanath temple with his consort Parvati, and where his devotees seek his darshan, or his guidance, if you like. So it seems we are no longer living in the past, and yet the past still lives in us. Seemingly, traditional religion plays less of a part in our lives, and yet our spiritual needs have never been greater. But like the pilgrims of old, we still seek the truth. We may travel as far as the Great Pyramids now, if the technology is cooperating, and I hope the computer will be very good. I haven't actually seen the pyramids themselves. Raise your hand if you have been to the Great Pyramids at Giza. There are some well-traveled people here. I'm sorry, the picture is not that great, but I'll try to make it a little bit bigger. How on earth did they build those structures? Pointing to the heavens, to the universe with such perfect symmetry. Maybe they had some assistants, who knows? To be struck by their majesty, and yet, do we go just for the view, or are we seeking something far deeper? From the view, perhaps, emerges a grander vision of what truly was, and simply let go of the baggage, the attachment which bind us. Maybe we need the ultimate boarding pass that opens up the way to the true destination we all have been seeking. Perhaps it's much closer than we think. Maybe the journey to sacred places has a way of opening up undreamt of inner spaces, which somehow meet at that still point inside ourselves. And when we reach that place, what do? We tend to be inclined to rest for a while. So if you've ever been to Adyar, who's been to that place in India? Adyar, the international headquarters of the Theosophical Society, a very green place, the lungs of Chennai in India. You feel like sitting down in the heat of the day and just resting for a time under the shade of the tree. A pilgrimage is an intentional journey into the experience of unknowing, for the sake of stripping away preconceived ideas and expectations and coming closer to the divine in every step you take. But it is not always an easy journey, and as the pilgrims in T.S. Eliot's poem Journey of the Magi discovered, it was just the worst time of year for a journey when they left on their pilgrimage, and such a long journey, the way steep and the weather sharp. Does anyone remember that poem from their childhood, perhaps? Journey of the Magi? They went with such expectation. Unfortunately, when they arrived, the three wise men, who were probably Zoroastrians or Parsis from Persia, following the star, following the light, it didn't quite meet their expectations. But at least they were prepared to leave all the delights of ancient Persia behind, to travel all that way, following a star. So the spiritual journey may not always necessarily be a pleasant one. Though often starting off joyously, there are times when it becomes more intense. No doubt, many of us have sought far and wide in the pursuit of truth. So we find ourselves attending the Theosophical Society in the pursuit of divine wisdom. And I couldn't find or think of a better place to be, because no one is trying to confine us or saying this is the truth or that is the truth or that you have to believe that. The beauty of this and the teachings is that the ancient wisdom is eternal. You can call it the Sanatana Dharma, the ancient wisdom, the perennial philosophy. It doesn't matter. They say it's always been there and will always be there at the heart of the universe, and no amount of dogma is going to change that. Einstein, as we know, said, well, there's so much in nature, it can give you all the answers, and the sages found the same thing. Peering into the heart of the eternal religion, they found these great cycles, these great truths of life, and experienced it themselves in those sacred inner spaces. It resides as pure consciousness in all things, including in the closest recesses of our own hearts. So close, we can almost hear our own heartbeat. And yet, like so many of these things, the truth can only be understood in paradox. Bit of a controversial statement there. So close and yet so far. At times we seem to take one step forward and two steps backwards. Hands up if you've had that experience. Just when you think you're making some progress, something will come up. Anger will rear its ugly head again. Or just being short-tempered or judgmentalism or some other negative feature of your personality will arise. Other times, we seem to make great strides, like a marathon runner. It's right in front of us, and yet seemingly veiled at times. Maya, it is said, illusion is very strong. It seems for most of us we need to travel so far, perhaps only to find that it is where we began after all. But we don't necessarily come right back to it and remain the same. If we consider what the Lord Buddha went through and his privations only to find the middle path and enlightenment while sitting under the Bodhi tree, well, if we consider those things, it seems almost impossible sometimes, doesn't it? And that can put you off. It's said that very few people are self-realized. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive for that. Would we have the courage to sit down, jettison all that we have under a tree, determined to find the truth? I would do that if there was a bit of comfort surrounding comfort, I think, and to protect you from the inclement weather and all of that. But more than likely, of course, we don't need to do that. It's all about the mind and the heart, isn't it? Wherever you are, you could be on a hillside in Tibet or in the middle of George Street in Sydney or the equivalent in Brisbane and still have a calm mind. We've all had surely those moments in meditation where we have touched that deep sense of peace, but only for a time. Perhaps life is the greatest journey after all and is connected to the great cycles of existence. We are born, grow up through childhood, adolescence to adulthood, only leading to middle age, then old age, death, and of course, theosophically speaking, rebirth. The great cycles go on, and it seems there must be a great outpouring of creation until we are able to return to the point where we began. Maybe it's only the apparent state of separation through which we can only appreciate the unity itself. Therein lies the paradox. Everything is unity, and yet everything seems to be separation. Our senses are inevitably drawn outwards, allowing us eventually to see the need to withdraw them once again in order to reclaim our true identity. Traditionally, in Vedic philosophy, there was the path of pravritti marga, which is the path of outgoing with the senses turning outwards towards the world. However, at some point, the soul begins steadfastly on the path of return, nivritti marga. While the first path draws the senses outwards, the second one encourages introspection and sense withdrawal. We may, of course, move between these two paths in our spiritual journey, constantly backwards and forwards. But Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita advises us, just as a tortoise withdraws its limbs, so too when a person withdraws his or her senses from sense objects, their wisdom becomes steady. It seems, therefore, that all the great teachers encourage us to turn within, to rediscover those inner spaces which are equally as significant, if not more so, than those sacred spaces that surround us, which may be everywhere. By merging a sacred place with a sacred space, we ultimately end up with sacred space everywhere, vibrant in every atom, giving life to seemingly inert matter. So where is the sacred not, so to speak? Could it be even in the profane, or technically consciousness is everywhere? Thank you. I think it might be okay. Is it just in those grand, sacred and religious structures, or just in the mountains, or in the sacred groves of old? Why could we not find the eternal in the most mundane aspects of our lives, as well as those most profound moments? There was this wonderful little Buddhist story. One day, a young Buddhist on his journey home came to the banks of a wide river. Staring hopelessly at the great obstacle in front of him, he pondered for hours on just how to cross such a wide river. Now, I'm not sure what my river looked like here, but I had a little image of a river somewhere in a wide journey road. It's here somewhere, along the river. We'll come to it when I can find it. We'll come right back to that, of the river. All right, let's just go into this one. Not quite a river, but it's a beautiful image anyway, which we will come back to. Water. Let's take that as our river for the sake of this. All right, I'm just going back to this story. Just as he was about to give up his pursuit to continue his journey, he saw a great teacher on the other side of the river. The young Buddhist yells over to the teacher, "Oh, wise one, can you tell me how to get to the other side of this river?" The teacher ponders for a moment, looks up and down the river and yells back, "My son, you are on the other side." No need to cross then. But maybe for most of us, that's a high level of realization, let's face it. Perhaps for most of us, we are compelled to cross that river on our journey, at least until we realize that the truth can be found anywhere. Maybe we need to go to Mount Kailash, or attend a silent retreat, or perhaps travel to Uluru and admire its beauty. But wherever we go, we take the mind with us. We could live in a cave in the snow, as some have, for many years. But is there any guarantee that would bring us closer to a still mind? It may help, possibly. Potentially, it seems for most of us we are meant to find truth right where we are. We could be in the midst of George Street or Queen Street in Brisbane and be absolutely unmoved and free. On the other hand, we could be living in a monastery in Tibet and find ourselves plagued by the mind and its desires. Does it really matter where we are? Rather, let's focus on what the mind is doing and where the heart really is. The Buddhists also apparently talk about the heart-mind as a combination. If the mind is still and the heart pure, then surely it's not necessary to go anywhere except perhaps within. So Madame Blavatsky reminded us, the mind is the great slayer of the real. It's a very useful instrument, which of course has lower and higher aspects, but an instrument just in itself, which cannot take us all the way, perhaps to the other shore. As the Buddhist teachings remind us, wonderful indeed it is to subdue the mind, so difficult to subdue, ever swift and seizing whatever it desires. A tamed mind brings happiness. Let the discerning person guard the mind, so difficult to detect and so subtle. A guarded mind brings happiness. Keep moving on. It's interesting that the interior world is so much more alluring, it seems, perhaps to us now at our stage, than the exterior world. If anything, the external world is a projection of the inner workings of the mind, perhaps. Indeed, a greater reflection, maybe, of the divine mind. Despite our apparent delight in the attractions of the external world, perhaps we are hardwired towards introspection. Aren't these movements, those moments of bliss in solitude, those things that are the most impactful and memorable? We surely all know what it's like to drive and be so absorbed in our own thoughts that we cannot remember how we reached our destination. Maybe we all remember those lines from Wordsworth's poem, whose heart filled with the pleasure at the beauty of nature as they flashed upon his inward eye. Time and time again, we are encouraged to turn our faces away from distraction and towards the still point within ourselves. The practice of meditation is a foundational practice that is crucial in the process of taming the mind, which can be our friend or our enemy. But of course, we all know about that monkey mind again. Now, I had a little picture here somewhere. Not a great one. Oh, the monkey mind. Down here. And the games the monkey mind can play. And hopefully in a moment, the vision will emerge of our monkey mind, which is a very literal interpretation, isn't it? But we know when the mind will not settle down. You sit for meditation and the mind wants to play its games. It could be termed as mischievous. The mind can find many excuses not to settle down. It can take a long time to calm it. Concentration and meditation are two very important practices in yoga. In that sense, the effort seems strenuous and the distance to travel vast, and yet, where do we have to go? It seems at times, the more we look outside, the further we are from it. Perhaps the exterior world can take us part of the way, but definitely not all the way. It cannot allow us to cross the threshold. And indeed, if the truth is right in front of us, then we should be able to see it. More often than not, however, it's as if we are outside looking in. So in theory, it should be as simple as repositioning ourselves at the center of the circle, rather than being confined by it. So changing our gaze may help, but it is only through stilling the mind and purifying the heart that the divine self can be glimpsed in the light of the Buddhi, so it is said. As intellectual awareness is useful, it will not suffice. As they say, the teachings have to sink more deeply into our being. As Lao Tzu once wrote, nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. So while we can hasten our spiritual attainment through effort, it may be wise not to miss a step along the way. Theosophy postulates that the soul evolves over a long period by assimilating the experiences of life, gaining qualities perhaps like compassion, intelligence, understanding. So on the one hand, the truth is right there, and yet on the other hand, it's a tremendous journey to undertake. To find it, for most of us, can be a little bit stubborn at times. Does this seem like a paradox? But on closer examination, is it really paradoxical? Nothing that we do is worth achieving without struggle. On the one hand, we have the survival of the fittest, and yet on the other, we have the reality that no life can exist without mutual cooperation. We are all dependent on each other, and the pandemic illustrated this. So how and why does the spiritual life end in paradox, it seems? It is said that the light of the world resides within us. Then that is a tremendous goal worth reaching. So how can something so precious be reached so easily? If it were that simple, then maybe it would not be worth pursuing after all. Finding and extracting diamonds has never been an easy task. What price do we put on such a gem which is said to be of incredible purity? Priceless. And indeed, the scriptures have said that the nature of the higher self, the Atman, is of knowledge, consciousness, and bliss. This self, which can be likened to a precious gem, lies deep within us, far closer to us than any heartbeat ever could be. It is said that it shines more brightly than any earthly light. If so, why may its brilliance be hidden? Maybe the problem is us. Maybe we're not looking in the right place. It's like an archaeological dig. Perhaps you can't quite find it. There was a little picture that illustrated this about the light. Yes, just let me see if I can find that. Just a beautiful little picture about the inner light. Here we go. And it may cooperate, and if it doesn't, we'll move on to the next picture. All right, let's just see if that comes up. This one was a little bit stubborn. Oh, here we go. But I'll need to make this one a little bit bigger, perhaps, and center it somewhat. Has anyone had this experience? I must admit I haven't. At least I've never really been able to see the light so directly. But perhaps we've sensed the light within. We felt very light in ourselves, in our bodies, during meditation. It says here, when the light on the Atman drives out our darkness, that light shines forth from us, a sun in splendor, the revealed Brahman or Absolute. Truly amazing how the power of light can dispel any darkness. If we simply strike a match in a darkened room, we see how easily light can irradiate the room. Similarly, self-realization has been described as a radiant awakening. It has been said that those who are truly enlightened, as mentioned, are very few. But that does not mean it's impossible or that we should give up. Rather, self-realization is our birthright and is worth striving to achieve, although it is a long journey. It's been said that there are those self-realized souls who have seen the truth and have been able to explain some of their insights to others. A noted Indian holy man of old said to his teacher when he first met him, "Sir, have you seen God?" The teacher replied, "Yes, I have seen God. I see him as I see you here, only more clearly. God can be seen. One can talk to him. But who cares for God? People shed torrents of tears for their wives, children, wealth, and property. But who weeps for the vision of God? If one cries sincerely for God, one can surely see him." Perhaps you've read that little extract before. So perhaps there are teachers, many teachers have written about their spiritual experiences. So they can't all be deluded. And surely their vision came from a calmer mind, a purer mind. Perhaps they were looking in the right place. Maybe we're looking too far ahead or too far behind or not right where it is. In ancient times, it was expected that the aspirant put their faith and trust in the teacher. You have to sit at the feet of the teacher for years and years and listen. I don't think the modern mind would be able to do that. It was also common to ask questions. It was believed that the aspirant also had the vision of the divine if they put the teachings into practice. So why perhaps has that vision eluded us up to this point? Though it may not. I'm sure I'm not speaking for everyone. Who knows for how many lifetimes we've been on this path of outgoing, our senses overwhelmed by the distractions, the game going on around us. Now, perhaps more recently, we have turned our attention towards the spiritual quest. Our instrument needs to be purified, and Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras has said that we should undertake certain disciplines in order to see the truth. He talks about the yamas and the niyamas, controlling the mind, practice of meditation and contemplation. They talk about shravanam, mananam, nididhyasanam, listening, contemplating, meditating on these truths. We have these impressions that we carry around with us, very often from the past, called vasanas or past impressions in the mind. They can indeed be very strong. And we're going along smoothly, thinking everything is going just fine. And some impression comes along from the past, and it may throw us off our path for a period of time. But nothing is ever lost. And collectively, after many lives of turning our senses outwards, we begin our journey back to the point where we left. Having turned our faces towards the light, nothing can be lost. And T.S. Eliot, a noted poet, also wrote, nothing can ever be lost. We must not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we began, and to know the place for the first time. Because surely we're not going to be different when we come back. Evolution in some form must have occurred. In a spiritual sense, there may be some deeper truth in this. At the heart of the universe is that unity of being, which is that source from which we emerge. The journey of outgoing seems essential to our spiritual and moral growth, as the self ironically comes to know itself. Surely the purpose of our existence is to know who we truly are, beyond the mind, beyond the body, beyond the intellect, the emotions, and everything else that just gets in the way. All these things pass and are not our true nature. It's said in the Mundaka Upanishad, let's go back to the rivers, but very, very briefly. Something about the flowing rivers. We can keep this here in the background. As rivers flowing down become indistinguishable on reaching the sea, so also the illumined soul, having become freed from name and form, reach the self-effulgent supreme self. Eventually, where else has the water got to go? Where else do we have to go? The international headquarters of the TS in Adyar, India, was founded in the 1980s under the vision of Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, who could have lived comfortable lives in Europe or in America, but no, they went to India in the 1880s. I first went to India in the 1980s, and I remember my first pilgrimage there. It was a difficult place to be, the roads and the noise and the traffic and all of that, and yet over time it becomes endearing like that. So they went through some struggle and hardship. As you walk through the estate today, you will find a range of shrines from the world's religions, including a Hindu temple, which is used by the Bharata Samaj, the Buddhist shrine, and the Zoroastrian temple. We had a community of Parsis, Zoroastrians, on the estate for some time. There's a Sikh Gurdwara as well, temple. Each of these have been used over decades for spiritual worship. When you enter the main gate from a busy road in Chennai, you eventually walk through the compound, but as you do, you are compelled to keep walking all the way past the Leadbeater Chambers, which is where the guests stay from overseas when there's a convention. All the way past the Leadbeater Chambers until you reach Adyar Beach. And what do you find there? You find the ocean. And interestingly, the Adyar River runs parallel to the estate, and it leads ultimately all the way to the ocean. Just as the rivers flowing down as they become indistinguishable from the sea, so our consciousness is inevitably drawn to the sounds of the ocean. As you get closer, naturally, that sound becomes significant. The sound is magnified until you become part of that experience. It seems we are compelled towards the sea, towards the ocean. Khalil Gibran wrote, I discovered the secret of the sea in meditation upon a dewdrop. And what might that secret have been? What possible relationship could a single dewdrop have with a mighty ocean? Maybe it's closer than we think. What possible relationship could our Atman, our self within us, have with the universal self? The essence is surely the same, though we become obsessed with form rather than the substance. We see separation and all the forms and features around us, the I-ness, if you like. Often we mistake things for being real that are not. The rope and the snake. You may be familiar with that word superimposition. One of the greatest little axioms was tat tvam asi in Sanskrit, which means that thou art, we are the divine self. Soham was another word. In that sense, we all spring from the sea to which we are destined to return, as it is representative of that ocean of consciousness. Madame Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine presents us with the reality, it seems, of spiritual evolution, which we need to go through to uncover these deeper spiritual truths. And yet, our true nature is already perfect, it is said, and not tainted. So upon truly knowing ourselves, we return to what and who we really are. But meanwhile, I'm almost done, so anyone's worrying about the time. But maybe now we're in universal time, so we can just spread it out a little bit. The truth has to be seen and experienced by ourselves. It's beyond mental speculation, though the mind, the rational mind, may help for a period of time. And speaking of the mind, that's where we seem to operate, isn't it? But what if there was some universal mind, which the perennial philosophy writes about? What if that universal mind were intimately connected to our mind? Maybe these are just what was called invisible waves of possibilities. The nature of universal mind is also the nature of our mind. At least the higher mind, that means that we all have that knowledge, known and unknown within us. And it's just a question of manifesting that awareness or removing those layers of ignorance. Perhaps the divine could be understood, particularly in the Western tradition, as like a superconscious mind, because we love the mind, don't we? We glorify the intellect. The intellect is everything. But what about the imagination? What about the emotions? What about emotional intelligence? In that sense, the higher mind may well be a gateway to universal mind, and therefore is the creative force behind the universe. Its thoughts are a reflection of our thoughts, maybe, and vice versa. And what we call synchronicity may well be just a coalescence of thoughts between our seemingly independent mind and universal mind. Collectively, of course, that universal mind might be fully described as universal consciousness. Buddhists perhaps may talk about universal mind. I'm not entirely sure. Other traditions might talk about universal consciousness, but maybe we're not talking necessarily about a personal God, so perhaps there could be semantic differences. Maybe the reality we perceive is just a projection of our own mind. So what we see in the physical universe is really a reflection perhaps also of a divine mind, perhaps seeking to know itself through other sentient beings, just like us. Maybe when we are looking up into the universe on a clear night, have you all done that? Looked up at the stars and dreamt? Maybe the universe could be looking right back at us. Have you ever thought that? Another question is therefore, is the reality we perceive just a dream of the absolute? A leela, a play, there is that idea as well. If everything we see is nothing but pure energy spinning around in space, then there may be, well, no solid objects. I'm not a scientist, I'm assuming that. And yet, we're not seeing the energy. So here we are in the room, a massive energy spinning around in space, but I'm seeing your form. I know your name. The chair supposedly is solid, but may not be so solid after all. But we don't have the eyes to see that energy. Maybe they don't have the right magnification, and maybe we don't have the eyes to see that this truth is right in front of us. Awakening literally means waking up from the dream, maybe living the dream without being in it. But the problem is we're drawn into the drama and we think it's real, and it's not. Is it just a matter of clicking our fingers and waking up? If only it were that simple. There are some people, though, who wake up, but maybe what they've been doing in their past lives has been intent. We've all read the experience of the great sage Ramana Maharshi, who just woke up. And he had no choice but to leave, because he saw what perhaps isn't immediately clear to us, though it might be. Some people wake up more easily than others. What must it have been like when Sri Krishna revealed his universal form to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita? Now, I've got down here somewhere that picture, which may well appear to a smaller picture, but we can make it bigger, of course. No doubt Arjuna, plagued by despondency and unable to fight, when Krishna revealed his universal form, he saw the absolute. That's one way of looking at the absolute. It would certainly be instrumental in our awakening, wouldn't it? I must admit, it hasn't happened to me like that. It may not be a grand vision on the way to Damascus either, but there are people that say they have visions, and who are we to say they don't? Could it be a reflection of the universal mind? Our minds are collectively the universal mind, and indeed universal consciousness. And ultimately, we are the director of the whole show. The universal soul alone is the creator of the beautiful. Therefore, to make anything useful, the individual must be attuned to the universal mind. So I've gone a little bit over, so I'll just move forward, but I just wanted to end with this profound symbolism, which you all know, of course, about the lotus flower. I think this one was the file that wasn't corrupted. So I'll press lotus 2 in the hope, yes, that the white lotus magically appears. It's such an archetypal symbol. It rises majestically out of the murky water and seemingly just is beguiling with its own beauty. None of the mud or the water can touch it. Its petals seem so fragile and yet together present us with a powerful image. But like all things, its beauty will fade and ultimately it returns to the elements. And isn't that just how it is meant to be? Two sides of the same coin, life and death. What good would beauty be if it lasted forever? It would soon lose its gloss. But as the late Thich Nhat Hanh also said, without the mud, you cannot have lotus flowers. It's a nice way of looking at it, isn't it? Without suffering, you have no way to learn how to be understanding and compassionate. And now to the last paragraph. But ever so gradually, with patience and persistence and practice, we rise above the mud, grow towards the light from which we came, to that place or state of being from which we sprung so long ago, where there is no change, it is said, no decay, no suffering, leaving nothing but the peace of your own true nature. So I'll just end briefly with a quote from the Perennial Philosophy and Aldous Huxley, who said, the perennial or the eternal philosophy is expressed succinctly in this Sanskrit dictum, I am that. The self is one with the universal self. The purpose of man or human beings is to discover this for himself or herself and find out who he or she really is. So that might be a sobering point to end. And if there are any questions anybody has, it's not very controversial, is it? I think I'm talking to a converted audience. Yes, please.
Thank you, that was lovely. Other stories. You said a guarded mind brings happiness. I think that's what you said. A guarded mind?
Yes, that was the way he expressed it. I guess a guarded mind could be perhaps a quiet mind, a mind that's not rushing out, is careful in its thoughts so that perhaps it doesn't harm others. A mind that is concentrated. Perhaps, I don't think guarded perhaps is the best word.
I
but
interpreted that as discipline.
oh yes, who would like to do that?
Discipline.
Disciplined mind, yes.
Yeah, some translations say discipline.
Yes,
So
some
that's the
say
word we
discipline.
need to- Yeah.
That's a good way, a controlled mind, I guess. But mostly it's the monkey mind.
The mind under care,
Mind under care, yes.
under your own care.
Yes. To be kind to ourselves.
Another question. I just didn't quite hear what you said. You said knowledge plus consciousness plus something was a gem.
Yes, like a gem.
But
Self
what
within.
was the knowledge and consciousness, and what was the third thing?
Well, I think I may have said bliss, I don't remember exactly, but the idea of that was that the self within is like a gem, a diamond. Only because we can only think of things in terms of material value. It's kind of gross, isn't it? But really a diamond is priceless. No amount of money can describe its beauty, and yet we manufacture them and chisel them and change their shape and we sell them on some kind of market, and yet it just has inherent beauty. So Annie Besant, wasn't she described as a diamond soul, I think, way back? So a diamond is maybe the closest thing we can think of materially to the self. There's a purity about a diamond that the self has. So we're not creatures of original sin. We are knowledge, consciousness, and bliss. Yes.
Such a
It's interesting that you mentioned the bliss in connection with that, because bliss in Sanskrit is ananda.
Yes.
A lot of the time it can be translated as ananda ananta, which is endless. Endless is the key word to bliss.
Yes.
Joy, happy, endless.
Yes.
And so therefore the bliss is endless.
Yes, it would be nice to have an experience of endless bliss, but often impatience. I'm a school teacher, so as I get older, face my retirement, impatience comes. So more and more in the classroom, I'm losing my impatience with the kids because that's something that plagues me. So I wish the joy was there all the time, but we have the reality of other things. But yes, it's good. There are moments of profound joy and bliss which can sustain us. It would be lovely to live in that state. But even those supposedly who were self-realized, who had experienced samadhi, come down from that state and then seem to be normal. And yet when they go into samadhi, sometimes they may fall down, they may have all sorts of experiences like that. So it's interesting. But bliss is beyond just happiness.
This isn't just
Content.
happiness, it's that endless that it will not end. It's not the happiness, it's the fact that it will not end is the
Yes, that would be a lovely state to be in. We can aim for that, hopefully, even though it doesn't always come.
Oh, can you say when the mind empties, the heart is full?
Sorry, say again?
When the mind empties, the heart is full.
Yes, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I don't know, I think the mind and the heart are very closely connected. Of course, the heart can be a center of emotion and you can be drawn out by those emotions, so you need your mind to discriminate. But I think the heart can see, I think the mind can see, and I think the heart can see.
The heart,
I mean,
has intelligence.
Yes. A mother, for example, surely can see so many things through the heart in the love for her children, like that. And yeah, the Buddhists talk about the heart-mind. I think they're very intimately connected. And I think in our modern culture, they're too centered in the mind and have forgotten the heart. And
When you empty your mind, there's no judgment.
Yeah.
You can't judge it.
yes. That's true, yes. And the mind tends to see people judge people, put them in boxes, and that's very, very safe to be able to do that.
And when we work through the heart, to see things as